Hello and welcome back. In this video, we will be learning about DNS. DNS is basically the phone book of the internet. It's a very common reference that we like to make. It translates simple names like google.com into IP addresses like 142.250.192.14 that computers need to communicate with each other. Without DNS, you would have to remember every IP address for systems that you use. It's very important when it comes to networking. You see, in networking, computers use IP address to communicate with each other. But instead of remembering every individual IP address, with DNS, we'll be able to use simple names instead of the IP address. But don't get this confused. Yes, we are using DNS to simplify communicating with these devices, but computers still use IP address as a foundation for their communication. And before we proceed, here are some important components of DNS. Now, first we have the primary zone, and the primary zone is a writable DNS zone. It is stored on the DNS server, and it holds the authoritative copy of the DNS zone for a domain. So things like host names, IP addresses, and service records will be stored on the primary zone. Now, when it comes to Active Directory, we have two types of primary zone. We have the Active Directory Integrated Zone, and this database is stored inside of the ntds.dit file, and it is replicated to all DNS servers. Then we have the standard primary zone, and the database for this is stored on the DNS server. Then we have the secondary zone, and the secondary zone in DNS is basically a read-only copy of a primary zone. Then we have a stub zone, which is a special type of DNS zone that holds only the essential records needed to locate the authoritative DNS server for another zone. Then we have the reverse lookup zone, which is the opposite of a regular forward lookup zone. So a forward lookup zone will map names like DC01 to an IP address, and a reverse lookup zone will map IP addresses to names. Next, we have some records that you might want to know. So first, we have the A record, which maps a host name to an IP address. So for example, server1.infotech.ca will be mapped to 192.168.50.20. Next, we have a quad A record, and this will map a host name to an IPv6 address. Then we have a PTR record, or a pointer record, and this is used in reverse lookup zones. It maps an IP address to a host name. We have a CNAME record that will map one hostname to another. For example, you can map www.infotech.ca to webserver.infotech.ca. We have an MX record that directs emails to a mail server for a domain. So for example, you could have infotech.ca being mapped to mail.infotech.ca. You have the start of authority record, or SOA record, and this defines the primary DNS server for the zone, the contact information, and the zone settings. And next we have the name server record, and this will list the authoritative DNS server for the zone. And then we have the TXA record, which is used for verification of policies like SPF records, DKIM records, and DMARC records. Alright, so let's dive in. I'm currently logged into my DC01 server, and from here I will open up Server Manager. Then I will click on Tools, then DNS. And this will open your DNS Manager, and this is where we manage all of our internal DNS settings. First, we can see that we have a few containers. We have our forward lookup zones, we have our reverse lookup zones, our trust points, and conditional forwarders. The forward lookup zone is the only container with objects in them. The rest are empty. So for now, we'll focus on the forward lookup zones. You can think of the forward lookup zones as the database that contains your DNS records. For example, when I try to resolve the hostname for fs-01.prbinvestments.local to get an IP address, your computer will reach out to DC01, which will then check the forward lookup zone to confirm what IP address it is. Within our forward lookup zone, we have two zones, the _msdcs.prbinvestments.local zone and the prbinvestments.local zone. One thing to notice is these zones, the types are Active Directory Integrated Primary Zone, and MSDCS stands for Microsoft Domain Controller Services. And it's a special zone that stores records used for Active Directory, replication, and domain controller location. The prbinvestments.local zone contains all name resolution records for the zone, in addition to all SRV and infrastructure records. I'll expand these out so you can see the items within. Inside of the prbinvestments.local zone, we can see the records it contains, and here's what each record does. The SOA, or the start of authority record defines authoritative information about the zone and controls how data is replicated, refreshed, and cached. The name server record lists which DNS servers are authoritative for the zone, meaning they can answer queries for that zone without forwarding them elsewhere. A record is the type of record that maps a hostname to an IP address. Okay, let's create our first zone. I will right-click on the forward lookup zones and create a new zone. We'll click Next on the welcome page. For the zone type, we have three options: primary, secondary, and stub zone. We'll leave primary zone selected, and we'll leave the option to store the zone in Active Directory. This way, it will get replicated to all of our domain controllers. We'll click Next. For the replication scope, we have three options. We can either replicate the zone data to DNS servers running on controllers within the forest. The second option is within the domain, and the third option is all domain controllers. But this is a legacy option, so I'll leave it to replicate within our domain, because when I extend my forest, I don't want these records to get extended beyond that. So we'll click Next. The zone name will be prbclients.com. We'll click Next. For dynamic updates, this option is basically what will happen if we create a record, like for example an A record within the zone. These options will decide what happens to the record. We'll leave it to allow only secure dynamic updates. Notice this is only available on Active Directory. The second option will allow both non-secure and secure dynamic updates. We do get an option letting us know that this option is a significant security vulnerability because it can receive updates from untrusted sources. The last option is to not allow dynamic updates, so we'll click Next and then Finish. With the new zone created, it will automatically create two files. One is the start of authority file, and the other is a name server file for DC01. Remember, the name server file is important because it is what DNS uses to determine if a specific server can respond to DNS query for the zone. A name server file will automatically be created for DC01, and because this is an Active Directory integrated zone, this zone will get replicated over to DC02. And when it replicates, it will create another name server file for DC02. So that means that both DC01 and DC02 will be able to respond to DNS queries for this zone. So next, let's head over to DC02. And inside of DNS Manager, we'll refresh the forward lookup zone. And you can see the prbclients.com zone that we just created on DC01 has been replicated over to DC02. And if you look at the contents for this zone, you can see that it created a name server file for DC02. So that's how we create a primary Active Directory integrated zone. As you can see, if you're within an Active Directory domain, these zones automatically replicate to all domain controllers. Now, let's create a standard primary zone. So back over on DC01, once again, we'll right-click on the forward lookup zones, then click on New Zone, and then we'll click Next on the first page. Then for the type of zone we want, we'll leave it as primary zone, but we'll uncheck the box to store the zone in Active Directory. We'll click Next. For the zone name, we'll name it prbassets.com, and then click Next. Then we're asked if we want to create a new zone file or use an existing file. We're told if we want to use an existing file, we need to ensure that it's copied to the required folder, which is in the system root environmental variable /system32 and DNS. So we'll open up our File Explorer and we'll navigate to that folder, which is system root /system32 /DNS. And this is where DNS store your zone files. and where it reads your zone files from. We can click on the sample folder to view the sample files in here. I can go back to the DNS folder, and we can see our current PRB investments.local DNS zone file here as well. And I can open this by right-clicking and then click on Open With and then select Notepad. Click OK. And this is the default database file for PRB investments.local DNS. Currently, there isn't much in here because for Active Directory integrated zone files, the DNS data is stored inside of the ntds.dit folder within Active Directory. So I will close this file, then I will close the DNS folder, and back in my new zone wizard, I will click on Next. For dynamic update, it's currently set to do not allow dynamic update, but I will change this to allow both non-secure and secure updates. Since we are in a test lab, for a production environment, the safer option is to not allow updates, but then you will have to create these records manually if you choose this option. I will click on Next, then Finish, and with that, we've just created a standard primary zone. As you can see in the type column, it's labeled Standard Primary. Because this is a standard primary zone, the DNS zone file is stored on DC01, meaning that if DC01 was to ever go down, systems that rely on DC01 for the DNS records related to prbassets.com will not be able to resolve those queries. So what we could do is we could head over to DC02, and first I'll just refresh the forward lookup zone, and as you can see, prbassets.com is not there. But what we can do is create a secondary copy of the zone file. Now first, before we do this, we do need to add the DC02 name server for the prbassets.com zone file. So back over on DC01, we'll right click on the PRB assets zone file, then we'll go to Properties, then the Name Server tab. We'll click on Add, and for the server fully qualified domain name, we'll type dc-02.prbinvestments.local, and we'll click on Resolve. We do get this message telling us that the server with this IP address is not authoritative for the zone, but that's okay because that's why we're adding it. We'll click OK, and we'll just confirm DC02 is a name server for this prbassets.com zone file. Then we'll just click on Apply and then OK. Then we'll head back over to DC02, and we'll right click on the forward lookup zone, and we will select New Zone. We'll click Next on the welcome page, and this time we'll choose Secondary Zone and click Next. The zone file name will be prbassets.com, and then we'll click Next. For the master server, we'll add 172.20.20.20. Then we'll click in the white space, and then we can see that it's attempting to resolve the name, but under validated, it does say OK. So we'll click Next, then we'll click on Finish. And that will create a secondary zone for us. Now, if I were to go back over to DC01, I will create a new A record, and the name will be DC-01. And the IP address will be 172.20.20.20. And then we'll click on Add Host, and we see we get a message saying that the record was successfully added. Now, if I go back over on DC02, I will hit refresh. And once I do that, we can now see that my newly created DNS A record has been successfully created. Next, we'll create another zone. So I'll right click on forward lookup zone and then click on New Zone. We'll choose Primary. We'll leave it to store the database in Active Directory. We'll leave it to replicate to all DNS servers running on domain controllers in this domain. We'll click Next. The zone name will be, and this is a long one, clients.prblogin.prbassets.prbinvestments.com. And then we'll click Next. We'll allow secure dynamic updates. and then we'll click Finish. And yes, this was a really long, fully qualified domain name, but if you look at the format, now remember I explained about subdomains in the beginning. This is generally what a subdomain will look like. We use subdomains to segment our domain into smaller services. I won't go into too much details for now, but just keep this idea at the back of your head. Okay, so we've just created a few zones. Now let's make use of them. And I'll start with a really long one that I've just created. So I will right-click on clients.prblogin.prbassets.prbinvestments.com and we'll choose New Host, A or Quad A record. The name will be DHCP. The IP address will be 172.20.20.23. And we can see that the fully qualified domain name is dhcp.clients.prblogin.prbassets.prbinvestments.com. Now, this is a really long name, but it is another way for you to contact the server at 172.20.20.23. So let's test this out. I'll log into my bclark PC. And I'll open up my command prompt. And then we'll ping dhcp.clients.prblogin.prbassets.prbinvestments.com. And we can see that yes, we do indeed get a reply. So it means that this DNS name that we've just created, we can use this name to contact the server at the IP address. Next, we'll do a NS lookup on the same DNS name. And we can see that it does resolve the name to the IP address. But if you're thinking, well, these names are supposed to make my life easier, isn't it just better to just use the IP address instead of the DNS name in this case because the IP address is shorter? And yes, probably. However, depending on the system, it could be set to obtain an IP address through the DHCP. And if the IP address changes, then another system will not be able to communicate with it. But if you use your DNS name, then even if the IP address changes, as long as the IP address has been updated in DNS Manager, you will be able to communicate with that system. Okay, so currently our system is set to use DC01 and DC02 as our DNS servers. But let's use something else. So what I will do is I will right-click on my network connection icon. We'll click on Open Network and Internet Settings. Then click on Change Adapter Options. Right-click on Ethernet 0 and then click on Properties. Select Internet Protocol version 4. Then go to Properties. And here we'll change the DNS settings from automatic to 8.8.8.8 as the preferred DNS server. Then I will click OK and then Close. Now if you don't know, 8.8.8.8 is a public DNS server that is provided by Google for anyone to use. Now that we've changed our DNS settings, let's see what works and what doesn't work. So what I'll do is I'll open up a web browser and we'll go to google.com and we can see that it works. I can type a random string of characters to search and it does indeed work. Next in CMD, what I'll do is I'll ping www.google.com and we can see that we do indeed get a reply. Next what I'll do is an ipconfig /flush DNS, and this command will flush our DNS cache entry from our system. Then if I try to ping dc01.prbinvestments.local, we can see that the ping request could not find the host. And this is expected because Google's DNS server will not be aware of any change you make to your internal network and your internal DNS. And even if you try to ping DC02, we get the exact same message. And no matter which server or which system that you try to ping, it will not work for your internal network. Now, let's say, for example, that we're in a different network. Let's say we're in a different domain, but we need to add records for DC01 and DC02. But we don't have access to the DNS manager, but we need to resolve these host names. What we could do is we could add these host names to the local DNS record on the system. So what I'll do is I'll click on my start menu, and I'll search for Notepad. And I will run this Notepad as an administrator. And very important, you need to run this as an administrator for the next steps. Then what we're going to do is we'll go to File, and then Open. And then we're going to navigate to the C drive, the Windows folder, the System32 folder, the drivers folder. And then here we have a folder called etc or etc. And we'll change the type from .txt to all files. And we want to open up the host files. Now think of this host file as your local DNS database. We can add records for host names that we want to be resolved that's not available on our DNS server. So what I will do is I will add 3 hashtags, or you could call it #. Then we'll add local DNS settings just to label this. Next, below that, we'll add our entries. Now we can see some examples above here. First, we need to add the IP address, then the DNS name. So we'll do that. So I'll add 172.20.20.20. I'll hit the tab key, and then I'll type dc-01.prbinvestments.local. And then we'll hit the tab key once more, and then I'll just type dc-01. And then I'll do the same thing for my DHCP01 server. And once I'm done, I will hit save on the file. Then back in command prompt. Now, if I try to ping DC01, I will get a reply. And if I try to ping DC02, we will get the host cannot be found error message. And if I try to ping DHCP01, we do get a reply. Now, this is a good way to add custom DNS records to a small number of systems. However, if you need to do this to a lot of computers, it will be tough to maintain all of these records. That's why using a DNS server is the best option. Okay, so I will reopen my host files, and I will add a hashtag in front of my 2 DNS entries because I don't want my PC to use these local records. I'll save, then close. Then I will reopen my network adapter properties, and I will set my DNS servers to be automatic, so it will be using DC01 and DC02 as its DNS servers. Now, let's add some DNS records. So first, let's head back over to DC01. Then I will click on the Start menu and open up my command prompt. And I will ping my OpenSense router at 172.20.20.254. And we can see that we do indeed get reply. Now, if I try to ping opensense.prbinvestments.local, we will get ping request could not find host error message, which is expected because there is no record for OpenSense within our DNS manager. So let's create one. Back in DNS manager, then I will right-click on prbinvestments.local, and I will select to create a new A or quad A record. Then the IP address will be 172.20.20.254. Then we can see the fully qualified domain name is opensense.prbinvestments.local. I will click on Add Host and then click Done. And we can see the new record has been created. Next, I will right-click on prbassets.com zone, and I will create another A record for OpenSense here as well. So the name will be OpenSense, and the IP address will be 172.20.20.254, and the fully qualified domain name is going to be opensense.prbassets.com. So we'll click Add Host and then close this window. Now, if I go back over to my command prompt and I try to ping opensense.prbinvestments.local, we can see that we now get a reply to show that we're now able to resolve opensense.prbinvestments.local to the IP address. And if I try to ping opensense.prbassets.com, that also works. Next, if I open a web browser and I navigate to https://172.20.20.254, I can hit the OpenSense portal. And I can also use the fully qualified domain name, which is https://opensense.prbinvestments.local, which also work. And lastly, we can use the opensense.prbassets.com, which does resolve it. But we can see that OpenSense is blocking us because it considers this to be a DNS rebind attack, and it tells you how to resolve it. Now, if you want a little challenge, you can do some research and find out how you can resolve this error message. Now, the next record that we want to create will be a quad A record, which uses IPv6. So what I will do is add an IPv6 address to my network adapter on DC01. So we'll go into Server Manager, then go to Local Server. We'll click on the IP address, and then go to the properties of Ethernet 0. Click on Internet Protocol version 6, then click on Properties. For the IP address, we'll use FD00:1234:5678:1. For the prefix, I will choose 64. I will not enter a default gateway. And for the DNS server, I will choose the same IP address. Next, we'll head over to bclark-pc and we'll add an IPv6 address here as well. So we'll head into my network connections. We'll go to Properties of the network adapter. Then we'll click on IPv6, and then we'll click on Properties, and then we'll enter the following IP address. So FD00:1234:5678:10. And the prefix will be 64. And for the DNS server, we'll use the IPv6 address of DC01, which is FD00:1234:5678:1. And then we'll click OK and then close. Now back over on DC01, we'll go back into DNS Manager and we'll create a new A or quad A record, but I will do this under the prbclients.com zone. The name will be DC-01. The IP address will be FD00:1234:5678:1, and then click Add Host. And then we'll add another record for bclark-pc. With the IP address FD00:1234:5678:10. And then click on Add Host and then close. Next, we'll head over to bclark-pc. And now I will ping dc-01.prbclients.com. And we can see that we do get a reply with the IPv6 address. And I will do the same thing for bclark. And it's a typo. It's actually bclark-pc. And once we do that, we do get a reply here as well. And we can even do a NS lookup, so we can see the details of DC01 and the IPv6 address that is assigned to it. So that's how we create A or quad A record, and these records are pretty easy to work with because they are so straightforward. Another type of record is called a CNAME record, and think of this record as like an alias or a nickname for another fully qualified domain name. So let's head back over to DC-01. For example, remember we created this really long zone? And typing the entire FQDN can be tedious, and you can even make mistakes when typing it. What we can do is create a CNAME record that points to this FQDN to make our lives easier. So that is what I will do. I will right-click on the PRB investments.local zone. Then I will select alias, CNAME, and the alias name will be DHCP. And we can see the fully qualified domain name is going to be dhcp.prbinvestments.local. And the fully qualified domain name will be dhcp.clients.prbassets.prbinvestments.com. Then we'll click on OK. Then we'll head back over to bclarkpc. And in the command prompt, we'll type ping dhcp.prbinvestments.local. And we can see we get a reply, and the destination that it's going to is that really long fully qualified domain name. So you can see how CNAME records can be very useful. We can create nicknames for very long or very complex fully qualified domain name, and this way when you're doing it, your records are a bit cleaner, and when you're working with different systems, using this method will make your life a lot easier. Another record we can create is called an MX record. MX records are used for email routing, and if we had an internal email server, we would need to create this record. I won't create it now because there's no point since we don't have an email server, but what I will do is I will right-click on the PRB investments.local zone, and I will choose Other New Records. And here we can see a list of all records that is available to us. Now, another well-known record is the TXT record. Think of the TXT record as kind of a post-it note for your DNS entries. For example, I can create a TXT record to show that I own the PRB investments.local domain. So what I will do is I will select the TXT record, then click on Create Record. For the record name, it will be _domain_verify. And the text will be a very long string of words, basically saying that I own this domain. And once I am done, I will click OK and then Done. Next, we'll head back over to bclarkpc. And then I will type ns lookup space dash type equal txt and space _domain_verify.prbinvestments.local. And we can see that the record we created is shown here. And just to show you that this record doesn't really exist anywhere else, I'll just press my up arrow key and then I'll change verify to test. And when I press enter, you'll see that this cannot find any record associated with this domain name. Now, when working with internal DNS, in my personal experience, I work with A records the most. Quad A records, not so much because IPv6 is not widely used as yet. CNAME and TXT records are used more with public DNS than with internal, but this is based on my experience, so your experience might vary. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you is working with reverse DNS. Currently, when we're using DNS, we're mapping host names to IP addresses. And if we want to find out what IP address is mapped to a host name, we can use the nslookup command. For example, I can type nslookup DC01, and this will show me the IP address of DC01. But what if I have an IP address and I want to find out what the host name is? Can we do that? Well, let's try it. So I'll type nslookup 172.20.20.20, and we get an unknown can't find 172.20.20.20 message. which is expected because our reverse lookup zone is not created. So we'll head back over to DC01, and in DNS Manager, I will click on the reverse lookup zone, and we see that we currently don't have any zones created, so we'll create one. I will right click on reverse lookup zones, then I will click on new zone, then click next on the welcome page. For the zone type, we'll leave it at primary. We'll leave it to store the zone in Active Directory. We'll click on next. We'll leave it to replicate the scope to all DNS servers running on domain controllers in this domain, then click next. We'll choose IPv4 as the reverse lookup zone, then click next. And then for the network ID, we'll use 172.20.20.20, and then we'll click on next. Next, we'll leave it to allow only secure dynamic updates, then click next. Then I will click on finish. Now that we have our reverse lookup zone, I will click on the PRB investments.local zone, open up the DC01 record, then I will click on update associated pointer record, then click on apply and OK. Now back in the reverse lookup zone, I will do a refresh, and we can see an entry for DC01 is now here. Next, we'll head over to bclarkpc, and I'll do an NS lookup for 172.20.20.20, and success. We've resolved the IP address to a host name. Now, if I try to do this for 172.20.20.21, we can see that it's not able to do it. So we'll head back over to DC01. We'll find the DC02 record in the PRB investments.local zone. And notice that the checkbox is already checked off for the record. But what I will do is uncheck it and then recheck it. And then I will click on apply. And then if I refresh the reverse lookup zone, we can now see the record. So back over on bclarkpc, I'll do a NS lookup on the 172.20.20.21 IP address, and there we go. We're able to resolve it to DC02. Now lastly, I'll head back over to DC01, and in DNS Manager, I'll create a new record under the prbassets.com zone. And we'll do this for DHCP01. And notice we have this option checked off to create an associated pointer record. So I'll click Add Host. And if we refresh the reverse lookup zone, we can see the new record was automatically created. Alright, so that is it for the video. Please leave a comment below if you have any questions or if you need any clarification on anything that I've explained so far. Let me know if you run into any issues, and I can help you out if you do. So thank you for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one.